Welcome, everybody, to the Sentinel Report. I'm Alex Newman, and it is February 10th of 2025. It's wonderful to have you with us, folks. So much to talk about today. We've got a PhD in political science later on today telling us about the Solemn League and Covenant. Turns out America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, maybe even South Africa, all of us are still bound to a covenant with God that our forefathers formulated back in 1643. You probably haven't heard about this. Most people haven't, but stay tuned. It is hugely significant. We also have the former EPA chief of staff during Trump's first term, the architect of our withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, Mandy Gunasekara. Very interesting lady. She's going to give us the latest on what Trump is doing on the environmental front, on the UN front, when it comes to the Green New Scam and climate change, and also how do we drain the swamp and restore federalism? One of the most important questions, because we all know eventually we're going to have another Democrat president. How do we prevent them from destroying our country? Well, all that and more with Mandy. So stay tuned for that. Also, some huge developments on the news front as Donald Trump continues taking a chainsaw to the deep state's tentacles. We'll have all that and more. But first, a word from the Word. This comes out of Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. The Bible reads, "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overpower it." It's a good reminder, folks. The gates of hell will not overcome God's church, okay? Always be encouraged, no matter what it looks like. We know that is a fact. Jesus also says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven." So that's a lot of power that God's people have been granted, and we need to use it wisely. Now, like I said, we've got a lot on the news front. I want to start with a new executive order issued just last week by Donald Trump to assess any ongoing infringements, he says, on the God-given right to keep and bear arms. Turns out the Second Amendment is pretty important. Donald Trump re-articulated it in that order. He said the Second Amendment is an indispensable safeguard of security and liberty. That's what our founding fathers said right in the Second Amendment. They said it has preserved the right of the American people to protect ourselves, our families, and our freedoms since the founding of our great nation. Because it is foundational to maintaining all other rights held by Americans, the right to keep and bear arms must not be infringed. Beautifully stated, Mr. President. The order also makes clear that Trump wants a report with all the different infringements that happened during Joe Biden, through the DOJ, through the ATF, and he wants a plan on how we're going to remedy those. So stay tuned for that, folks. That is going to be hugely significant. We've also got another executive order signed the day before. This was on Thursday, creating a Justice Department task force that's going to eradicate what the president calls anti-Christian bias within the federal government. And we gave you multiple examples of that over the last 4 years, the persecution of pro-lifers, the equating of pro-lifers and Christian activists with terrorists. The anti-Christian bigotry from the last administration was just out of control. In the 2023 House Subcommittee Select Committee report on the weaponization of federal government, they actually found that under the guise of tackling domestic terrorism, the FBI was literally sending spies into Catholic churches, okay? That's how absurd this got. And Donald Trump says, hey, that's enough, right? The task force is supposed to, and I'm quoting here from his order, immediately halt all forms of anti-Christian targeting, including through the DOJ, the FBI, the IRS. And he talked about it a little bit at his National Prayer Breakfast speech on Thursday as well. He says, in addition, the task force will work to fully prosecute anti-Christian violence and vandalism in our society and to move heaven and earth to defend the rights of Christians and religious believers nationwide. Folks, this is really, really significant, okay? And if you look at some of the examples that we saw over the last 4 years, you realize we were really close to the edge there. I mean, they were targeting Christian parents. They wouldn't let parents adopt if they were Christians. I mean, we had some radical abuses. And this is actually part of something happening that is much bigger than just reining in the abuses. In his speech at the National Prayer Breakfast last week, Trump said something really, really powerful about rejecting secularism and bringing God back into American life. Check it out.
The element, the everything that's going to be happy. People of religion are going to be happy again. And I really believe you can't be happy without religion, without that belief. I really believe it. I just don't see how you can be. So let's bring religion back. Let's bring God back into our lives. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Great honor. Thank you.
Yeah, we absolutely must, folks. It is essential if we're going to make America great again. And I want you to stay tuned for our next segment because we've got Dr. Michael Wagner coming on to break down the Solemn League and Covenant. Of course, Trump's got his roots in Scotland, so you're going to want to hear this desperately. Now, something a little more troubling, in my opinion, also at the National Prayer Breakfast, Trump announced a White House faith office that was going to be led by, quote-unquote, Pastor Paula White. Check this out.
This week, I'm also creating the White House Faith Office, led by Pastor Paula White, who is so amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about that. I've already talked to some pastors who are pretty concerned about this. Paula White has an interesting record of saying things that maybe don't line up perfectly with the Bible. And in fact, it's only a recent phenomenon that we have female pastors. The Apostle Paul writes twice in his letters that women should not be teaching in churches. Women should not be preaching. So this has been a debate within the Christian church for the last few decades. And there's quite a few traditional Christians who don't buy into this idea. Now, Paula White, again, as I mentioned, has said some things that are pretty interesting. I want you to listen to something she said just recently.
Wherever I go, God rules. When I walk on White House grounds, God walks on White House grounds. I had every right and authority to declare the White House as holy ground because I was standing there, and where I stand is holy.
Okay, I'm just going to leave that there. Now, moving on to another critical issue involving the climate hoax, and we're going to talk to our second guest today, Mandy, Gunasekara, former EPA Chief of Staff, about this. We've got a UN court that is absolutely hoping to enslave humanity with the climate hoax. In fact, there's this enormous battle taking shape. Later this year, the UN, what they call the International Court of Justice, sometimes they call it the World Court, as if it were like the Supreme Court for humanity. They are getting ready to make a hugely significant ruling later this year. I just did a big article about this in the New American Magazine. I've got another one coming out soon in the Insider Report and in a publication in Germany. So we'll keep you posted on that. But you have the UN asking its court to rule on what they're calling the obligations of states, of governments, with respect to climate change and carbon emissions. And they're not kidding, folks. They absolutely believe that this UN court is going to have the power to set climate policy for decades to come. And they're saying so very, very openly. The guy who is kind of leading the charge, he is a representative of the government of Vanuatu. I want to read to you what he said. He said, "This may well be the most consequential case in the history of humanity." Okay, this is Special Envoy for Climate Change and Environment, Ralph Regenavanu, for the Republic of Vanuatu. Again, this is the government that's demanding this case be heard. And speaking of the court, just in December, he said this: "We look to the court for recognition that the conduct which has already caused immense harm to my people and so many others is unlawful, that it must cease, and that its consequences must be repaired." He's talking about carbon dioxide emissions, right? The gas of life. Emissions of the gas of life are unlawful. Imagine if a global kangaroo court declared that emissions of CO2 are unlawful. You literally exhale CO2. Everything you do produces CO2. So this is the kind of bonkers stuff that's happening at the international level that the fake media is not going to tell you about. One of the few articles I found about it in the American press, this came from the New Yorker. They said this was putting the entire industrialized world on trial. Oh, that's cute. Since when does a UN court have the authority to put us on trial? Okay, this is crazy, folks. And yet they're openly telling us that agriculture, energy, transportation, all of it is right in the UN's crosshairs. It's amazing, folks. It's absolutely amazing. Meanwhile, Trump is taking an absolute chainsaw to all these climate shenanigans. So we'll talk to Mandy about that. Stay tuned for that because, folks, unbelievable things happening there. Now, I wanted to turn to another thing that Trump has done. This is something that's been near and dear to me for a long time. I used to live in South Africa. I've got many friends in South Africa. I love the peoples of South Africa. They're wonderful. And starting 15 years ago, I started learning about what was really going on in South Africa. I started writing articles about it. And I posted some of them on my X. I encourage you to go check them out. The first big one that I did was a cover story for the New American Magazine called "Genocide and Communism Threaten South Africa." And we were attacked and ridiculed and conspiracy theory and all the rest of it. Well, the truth has finally been heard at the highest levels. And we've got Donald Trump now signing an order on South Africa that's going to end U.S. subsidies to this crooked regime in its persecution of Afrikaners. And he's actually going to be allowing them to come to the United States. Hugely significant. The order is called Addressing Egregious Actions of the Republic of South Africa. And what he is doing with this is highlighting these things, letting people know that this is happening, and trying to stop American subsidies for this horror, and trying to make a way for the Afrikaners, who, by the way, are America's closest cousins. There's no people group in the world more closely related to Americans. And, people say it's the Brits. It's not the Brits. The Afrikaners actually fought a war against the Brits like we did for freedom, for religious freedom, for political freedom, for economic freedom. Of course, they lost, we won. But, hey, these people are being targeted for elimination, and we have to stop this. Now, Elon Musk actually just used a video that I have highlighted many times, including on an episode I did for my show Behind the Deep State, of one of the top political leaders in South Africa, Julius Malema. He used to be the leader of the Youth League of the ruling party. Now he started his own party, the Economic Freedom Fighters. I want to let you just hear a little bit of this, where they're chanting about killing the Afrikaners, the Boers, the farmers. Check this out. Oh, maybe we don't have the video. Okay. So, hugely significant, folks, that this is now getting out there. And I hope you will share with others, folks. And I'm really glad that Trump is going to allow some of these people to come in. These are real refugees. These are really people who are being ruthlessly persecuted, massacred, forced out of the economy. It is terrible. South African government's crying and whining and all the rest of it. Let them do it. The way they have treated these people, and not just the Afrikaners, I mean, what they did to the Zulus is horrific. But these people need to be exposed, and we need to, as much as we can as a country, without getting involved in their politics, help to protect innocent people. Now, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who's been one of the leaders of the freedom movement, the sovereignty movement, the effort to bring cultural Christianity at least back to the forefront, just bragged about his country's success in defying the liberal globalist elites. I want you to check this out.
Mi otthon 15 éve építjük a szabad, konzervatív és keresztény Magyarországot. Magyarország ma a konzervatív politika laboratóriuma. Megvédtük magunkat a migrációtól. Nálunk nem jut be egyetlen illegális migráns se Európába. Migrációban Magyarországon nincs kompromisszum. A migránsok száma Magyarországon zero. Bevándorlók helyett a saját magyar családjainkat támogat.
We can cut here. Amazing, folks. And I actually had an opportunity to go visit the Prime Minister's office last time I was in Budapest. I sat down for almost half an hour with their Secretary of State. I encourage you to go watch that. These people understand what's happening. They understand what the globalists are doing. They're trying to destroy our countries, destroy Christendom. And it's great that it is now finally being recognized that they were right. Their policies worked, and we need to keep all of them in prayer. Now, before we go to break, folks, this is huge. Over a dozen states right now are looking at possible criminal charges against Anthony Fauci. Of course, he got the federal pardon, but that doesn't mean he is free and clear yet. We have state attorneys general, we have state laws, state criminal laws that govern a lot of these issues. And South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson is leading a coalition of 17 state attorneys general, asking Republicans in Congress about whether these criminal actions by Anthony Fauci may have violated any state laws that wouldn't be covered by Joe Biden's pardon. So we'll bring you more on that, folks, but this is hugely significant. And before we go to break, like I said, we're going to be right back with Michael Wagner. We've got our friends over at 1 Acre, Iowa. I want you to go check this out. They make these beef sticks that are just amazing. They're made with regenerative farming. They're feeding them organic hay. They've got all kinds of amazing products, hot honey, right? They've got the mixed mushroom. My kids love these things. I love these things. They're just wonderful. So get over to oneacreiowa.com. That's oneacreiowa.com, and use the promo code Newman. You're going to get a 10% discount when you order these. You'll even get a 10% discount on the first few if you sign up for a recurring subscription. So get over there, do that, support local regenerative farmers and this program. And stay with us. We're going to be right back talking about the Solemn League and Covenant that our guest says we are still bound by. We'll be right back.
Are you concerned about your child's education? Have you considered looking into alternatives to public school but don't know where to start? Greater Than I Ministries will give you the tools you need with a free Home Educators Kit and 15% off our Thinking Like a Christian Biblical Worldview video series. Available on DVD or streamed to your home or device, this series will thoroughly equip you and your family with the truth you need about the battle of ideas being waged against our families and our nation. And our free Home Educators Kit will provide you with links directly connecting you with all the resources you need if you're considering rescuing your children from the public indoctrination schools. Go to gtimin.com and click the green banner at the top to receive your free Home Educators Kit and 15% off our Thinking Like a Christian Worldview video series. Again, that's gtimin.com and click the green banner at the top. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome back to the Sentinel Report. Alex Newman, your host here. Thanks so much for being with us, folks. And we have a very special treat for you today. It turns out America and the United Kingdom and Australia and maybe even Canada are still bound to God by a covenant that was signed hundreds of years ago. And if this is the first time you're hearing about that, welcome to the club. That is true for the vast majority of Americans and Brits and Scots and Australians. But in fact, I knew nothing about this. I was very familiar with the English Civil War, what happened there. Oliver Cromwell, I think, was a fascinating historical figure. But turns out that these people, back in the 1600s, signed an agreement with God. And according to our next guest, Michael Wagner, that agreement is still in effect, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, it is still in effect. So our guest is Michael Wagner. He's an independent researcher and writer. He's a columnist for the Western Standard. He's got a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. He's written a number of books on Christianity and politics in Canada and also the Alberta independence movement. He and his wife have 11 children, so a very good start, and they've been homeschooling for about 30 years. He sent me a copy of his book, The Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, Rediscovering the Validity and Importance of the Solemn League and Covenant. It's a very short, very easy read, and absolutely mind-blowing. Michael, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you for writing this book. Let's start with the obvious question. What is the Solemn League and Covenant? Because I think it's safe to say most of our viewers and our listeners have never heard of this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Alex. The Solemn League and Covenant was something I myself only learned about, 30 years ago or something, but it's a very important part of English-speaking history that people have forgotten. And so in 1643, the governments and churches of England, Scotland, and Ireland made a covenant to obey God, as nations. It was a national covenant. Now, this is based on Protestant theology of the time, which looked back to the Old Testament, where, especially in, say, Second Chronicles, you'll have kings like Asa or kings like Josiah, who, when there's a time of national revival, they'll make a national covenant on behalf of their people with all the people. And so that was the theology in the 17th century. And so when there was a crisis in Britain, those three countries, their governments and the churches, made a covenant with God to obey God and to follow him. Now, if you know a bit of English history, things didn't play out the way we would have hoped after that, because eventually King Charles II came to power and he tried to overturn the covenant. And so after he did that, there were still people who remained faithful to it, and they were persecuted. They became known as the Covenanters. So there's the idea of Covenanters being persecuted in 17th century Britain. That's better known than the Solemn League and Covenant itself. But the Solemn League and Covenant was a covenant made by Britain with God. And when you make a covenant with God, you don't just turn your back and walk away. It doesn't fade away. It's still there. So those obligations that Britain made with God are still, they're still an obligation upon the British people. But what's important here too is, if I can, I don't know if you, after Britain made that covenant, certain countries were founded by British settlers. Canada, the United States, Australia. You mentioned some of those. Those settlers themselves were under obligation to God through the Solemn League and Covenant. So when they founded these new nations, those new nations take on those covenant obligations. So that's kind of the thrust of the book. What I'm trying to explain there.
Yeah, and I think you made actually a very persuasive case that this may still be in effect. So I want to come back to that. But before we get any more into that issue, explain to the folks what was in this covenant. What did these people agree to do? What were they asking God for in return? Talk to us about this Solemn League and Covenant. What did it say? What did it mean?
Well, of course, this was like in the 17th century. You still had kings like King Charles I at that time, who they claimed to have divine right rule. They claimed to have absolute rule and rule over the church. And also, there were still, like, especially in England, there were a lot of man-made traditions still within the church there. So the covenant itself was taken in 1643 because of the English Civil War. Like, the Scottish were already trying to base their church on biblical values. The English Parliament was controlled by Puritans, and they were in conflict with Charles I, who was trying to impose man-made doctrines on the church. So the English Parliament united with Scotland in this Solemn Covenant, and there was going to be civil and religious reformation. They would have civil government according to the scripture, which would mean you do not have divine right government. You have rulers chosen by the people. And in the church, you would have government doctrines and worship determined by the Bible and not by civil rulers. So it was reformation in church and state to have their nations governed according to the word of God. So it wouldn't be, man-made rules in either the civil or ecclesiastical sphere. It would be governed according to the Bible. So the purpose of the Solemn Covenant was for both nations to reform themselves in accordance with the scriptures, so that they'd be ruled under God rather than under the rules of arbitrary men.
And so what were some examples of how that would play out in practice? I mean, what does it mean that the king and the government should obey God's law? I mean, does that mean the king doesn't get to murder, doesn't get to steal, doesn't get to just do whatever he wants because God put him in that position?
Absolutely. I mean, biblical Christianity is the foundation of freedom in the world. When you look at the freest countries in the world, like, United States, Britain, and Canada, it's because we were historically under a Christian worldview. It's the Christian worldview coming from the Bible that explains that God is above the government. The government is not the highest authority. And so the king cannot be the highest authority. God is the highest authority, and he tells us how to live in his Bible, in the scriptures. So when you have an authority above the government, you can appeal beyond the government and say, no, Mr. King, or whoever you are, you're wrong, and God is right, and we need to be governed according to what God's word is. So this creates freedom because it creates, it acknowledges that God is above the government, and the government is not the highest authority. And so sometimes the government will disobey God, and we can obey God rather than men, and do what God wants rather than what the civil ruler wants. So this is actually the fundamental basis for freedom in Western society.
Wow. That's amazing. And I've been reading a lot about English history, Anglo-Saxon history. I'm fascinated by King Alfred. I'm fascinated by the Magna Carta and the Army of God, forcing King John the Tyrant to respect at least the rights of some people and have elected representation and consent to the governed and things like that. This seems to have been almost completely expunged from our collective consciousness, Michael. I mean, as you know, probably better than me, very few people in Britain, in Canada, and the United States today have any idea of this history. We've just got these very secular conceptions of human rights, and they're very nice, and so we should support those ideas. But you think all this really goes back to the Bible and to what God said? And I want to ask you another thing, too, in line with that. This is where the whole idea of lex rex comes from, that the law of God is actually the king is not the law. Talk about that and how God's law could be a check on the ambitions of rulers, governments, presidents, kings, etc.
Well, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was at this very time there was a famous theologian named Samuel Rutherford, and indeed he wrote a book called Lex Rex, and that was part of this whole theology. Samuel Rutherford was one of the Covenanters. He was one of the people involved in this movement, and so this was very much a movement to make law, like Lex Rex, if I understand correctly, is the law is king. Like, every person is under the law. Even the king himself is under law, the law of God. And so that was a very important book, Lex Rex. It was actually burned by King Charles II, if I remember correctly, because they didn't like that. But Samuel Rutherford and this concept was very much a part of the Covenanter movement. The government is under law of God, just like every individual. And this limits government. If government is under the law of God, it is limited in its powers and what it's allowed to do, because the Bible delineates, what the government's authorities are, what it can do. I mean, especially, you think of Romans 13, every civil magistrate is a minister of God who's supposed to punish the evildoers and reward those who do good. I mean, the Bible designates that as the way the civil government is supposed to operate. And so if we have Lex Rex, if we have the rule of God, we end up with freedom, because government and its its various bureaucrats and politicians are restrained in their authority. Their authority is restrained by the word of God.
Amen. And this really was translated almost directly into American jurisprudence. If you go back and read, for example, Sir William Blackstone, Commentaries on the Laws of England, this was universally known and understood by America's founding fathers. It was actually the most cited legal book outside of the scriptures. And he was very clear. The Bible and the laws of God are supreme over all nations at all times, and it doesn't matter what anybody thinks about it. That's just the way it is. And if you decide to violate those, you're acting illegitimately then. Michael, I want to move to something maybe even more controversial than everything that we've been talking about now, and that is the idea that this is still in effect, that America and Canada and the UK and Australia and maybe some others, maybe South Africa and other parts of the British Empire would still be under these rules, under this covenant. Of course, there are people who dispute that because, as you pointed out, the later governments tried to revoke that and persecute the people who believe that. But you argue that this is actually still in effect. Explain to us why you think that, and what are the repercussions? What does that actually mean for Canada, for America, for Scotland, for Australia?
Well, when a nation makes a covenant with God to obey God, and it's a scriptural covenant, a subsequent government cannot just repeal that. Like, you don't bind yourself to God and then repeal it. You don't turn back. Once you've bound yourself to God, you're bound to God. And so despite what Charles II thought, he could not pull Britain out from under the obligations of this covenant. So the obligations of the covenant are for posterity. They go down generation after generation. So the subsequent generations that, like I mentioned, moved to what's now the United States or to Canada, they would still be under those covenant obligations. Now, it's more easy to understand this for countries like Australia and Canada, which still have the monarchy as our head of state, because you can see the direct connection with Britain. Where there's people in the United States who say, well, we broke off our connection with Britain. We don't have those ties with Britain anymore. Therefore, we're not under a British covenant. But again, the central point, the seed idea, is that it's a covenant with God. So certainly the United States does not have obligations to Britain anymore, but the obligations that were to God in terms of obeying God in government and church, those obligations are still there. So the implication of this is that we are covenant-breaking nations. Like, we have obligations that we've made to God, or at least our ancestors made on our behalf. We are still bound by those obligations, and when we ignore them, we incur God's wrath. So our nations, over time, will incur God's wrath by disobeying the covenant, by ignoring it and not paying attention to it. And the fact that we don't know about it does not, bring us out from under the obligation, because we should know about it. I'm surprised that I didn't know about it earlier. I'm surprised that people don't know. This is a major event in history. You have a major country, Britain, making a public covenant with God. And this is not something was done in secret in a corner somewhere. This is major 17th century history, if you'd read it. And the covenant obligation continues on to posterity, generation after generation. And we are in violation of that. Now, God is very merciful, and we haven't seen, his full wrath. But the more that we walk away from him, and in our civil government, we make laws against God's laws. We have laws that allow babies to be killed, for example, and that overturn the traditional definition of marriage. As we turn away from God in our public life and in our private life, we will incur his wrath, because we are violating the obligations that our ancestors took on our behalf.
Yeah. As you talk about some of the crazy things happening in our societies, I'm reminded of Romans 1, where you read that actually suppressing the truth of God actually leads to judgment, but is also the things that come from that, like the rampant perversion and other things, are actually part of the judgment itself. And so it certainly seems, and I've said for many years, even before I knew about any of this, I've said it certainly seems like God is judging the United States and Canada in a very real way. Michael, we've only got a few more minutes in this segment. This is such a fascinating discussion. So I do want to encourage people to go ahead and get a copy of that book. You can find it on Amazon, The Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, Rediscovering the Validity and Importance of the Solemn League and Covenant. But Michael, I want to ask you a hypothetical. Let's say you had an opportunity. You've got a meeting now, and you've got Prime Minister Trudeau, you've got President Donald Trump, you've got the leaders of Congress, the leaders of Parliament, governors, provincial governors in Canada. You've got the Prime Minister of Australia. You've got all the pastors together, and you have an opportunity to tell them, hey, guys, this covenant is still in effect. Here's what you need to do. What should they be doing? What should we be doing as Americans, as Canadians, as Christians? And just to kind of preempt the objection, well, we have freedom of religion. We've got pagans. We've got Hindus. We've got devil worshipers. How do we deal with all of that? So what would you tell all these folks about what our obligations are, how we should respond right now, and how do we answer those objections?
Well, the first thing, of course, is we have to re-understand the Solemn Covenant. We have to look at the history, see what's there. We have to read the covenant and understand our obligations. And then we have to repent. We have to turn back from the evil things that our countries have been doing, like I mentioned with abortion and so on. We have to turn back to the Bible, to God's ways. We have to acknowledge God. I mean, that's kind of the fundamental thing. We have to acknowledge God and his authority, that he is over us, that those leaders that you mentioned, whether it's President Donald Trump or the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, they are supposed to be ministers of God as civil magistrates. And so they should be repenting of anywhere they've turned away from God, any laws and policies that they advocate that diverge from the scriptures and what God says. We have to get back to God. And, if we turn back to God, he will be merciful, and he will, reward, with spiritual blessings, those who will turn back to him, repent of their wrongdoing, and go back to him. So I would tell these leaders they need to learn of the covenant and the obligations that they have, in the covenant, which reflects the scriptural obligations, to turn back to that, and to encourage their people also to turn back to the scriptures, because fundamentally, it's the citizens that are most important. It's got to be a grassroots kind of a movement. And, we're not asking anybody to do anything. We're just asking people to turn back to God and obey God. And, so I don't think that violates anybody's freedom if you want to, turn to God and believe on him and receive his blessings, and it's to turn away his wrath ultimately. You know what I mean? When our countries are under God's wrath to an increasing degree because we've turned away from the covenant, and when the covenant and when the civil leaders turn back to God, God will bless, and that blessing will be for the whole nation, not just it won't just reflect in the lives of those leaders who turn back, but there will be blessings upon the nation that will be beneficial for everybody. So it's basically a movement of repentance. Acknowledge our responsibilities under the covenant, repent and turn back to God and believe on him.
Very good, Michael. We are out of time, but best way for the folks to get this book is at Amazon?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay, very good. And do you have a website or any other place where people can follow your work, Michael?
I have a website, drmichaelwagner.com, but my books are available on a website called merchantship.ca, which is it's a Canadian website. But this book, The Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, is available on Amazon.com. But if they want to know about other books, merchantship.ca, it's a homeschooling organization, homeschooling supply organization, and they carry some of my books, including this one as well.
Excellent. Well, Michael, it's really been a pleasure to be able to talk to you about this. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for reminding all of our peoples about this very, very important historic document that, hey, may still be in effect today. We appreciate it, Michael. We encourage everybody to read the book. Thank you, sir, and I hope we can talk to you again very soon.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's been a privilege to be on here.
Absolutely, sir. God bless you. Thank you so much. Folks, go get a copy of this. Again, it's a really short read. I mean, I read it in a very short airplane trip. I would hold it up for you, but my son is reading it, and so I think he's got it in his school backpack or whatever. But check it out. It's called The Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, Rediscovering the Validity and Importance of the Solemn League and Covenant. It is very important history, and it may be more than that. So I think it would behoove all of us to pay attention. Stay with us. We're going to be right back after this quick break with much more about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Exciting, exciting times. Stay tuned.
In 1776, a nation was born, forged in the crucible of revolution. Brave men and women stood together fighting for freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Throughout history, the spirit of patriotism has prevailed. The battles may have changed, but the values remain the same. Today, in 2024, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment where the call for unity, freedom, and a better future echoes louder than ever. Introducing Patriot Mobile, the wireless carrier that stands with you. We are committed to supporting the values that make our nation great. With affordable plans and reliable nationwide coverage, Patriot Mobile is not just a wireless service. It's a call to action for those who believe in the American dream. Because this year is not just any year, it's the most important year since our nation's founding. Choose a wireless carrier that shares your values. Choose Patriot Mobile. For free activation, use promo code Newman.
Welcome back to the Sentinel Report. As promised, we have huge news on the environmental front, the climate scam front, and we got a very special guest to break it all down for us. As we have reported here on this program for the last few weeks, Trump has really taken a chainsaw to the what he calls the climate fraud, the climate hoax. He said it needed to be one of the top priorities of the MAGA movement to destroy this hoax. And just in the first few weeks, it's been extraordinary to watch. He signed an executive order on putting America first in international agreements having to do with the environment, got us out of the Paris Agreement, got us out of, according to the order, any agreements, conventions, pacts, finances involving the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the treaty that underpins it all. And he also ordered a review of the Endangerment Finding, which declared back in 2009 that carbon dioxide, the gas we exhale, is actually some sort of toxic pollution that needs to be regulated by the EPA under the Clean Air Act. Joining us to discuss all of this and more is Mandy Gunasekara. She was the EPA chief of staff during Trump's first administration, really the architect of our withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Last time we talked to her, she talked about targeting the UNFCCC and how critical that would be. And it looks like Trump is really moving in that direction. Mandy, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. You've got an incredible new book, too. Y'all Fired, A Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. It's great to have you with us. What do you make of the first few weeks of Trump's attack on the what he calls the climate fraud? Is this good news?
It's great news. And what I really see is he's not wasting any time this go round. Something we actually lost a fair amount of precious time in the early days. And so he's shown that he has been ready, strategizing, and really thinking about not just these initial policy actions to take, but also some of the broader structural changes. Doge is leading a lot of this. There's a lot to get in there, but also these scientific reviews. I mean, you mentioned the review of the endangerment finding. This is literally considered the holy grail of scientific assessments for the left. And it's because so much of their Green New scam, the policies affiliated with establishing greenhouse gases as a quote pollutant, is built on this finding that probably a lot of people don't know about, but it has so much influence over the left's ability to corrupt agencies like EPA and then put out regulatory standards that mean they get to choose the winners and losers or pick which industrial actors get to operate, get permits, things along those lines, and which ones do not. So it's a really, really powerful tool. And it shows the president isn't just thinking about top line policy decisions, which are extremely important. He's also going from the bottom up, looking at scientific reviews, scientific assessments, and then, of course, the structural changes, which will ensure a lot of these actions are long lasting.
Yeah, so looking at this review of the endangerment finding, very few people are talking about this, and yet I think it's so important. This actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and somehow the Supreme Court agreed with this. I guess that was back when they were still deferring to agencies on everything. Maybe that'll be challenged again. But you've got Lee Zeldin there. I don't know Lee. He may be a super nice guy, but he is one of the handful of Republicans in Congress who did embrace the idea that man-made climate change is real, and we just need conservative solutions to it. What does this review mean in practical terms? Do you think there's a good chance that the EPA will end up reversing that finding? What does that look like? What are the implications then for all the policies that were built on that finding? What are some of the different ways this could all go, Mandy?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we take a look at it, and you have to back up. A lot of members of Congress and people in the first Trump administration, they had accepted the legal state of play. Some things have changed since then that are really important. One of them being Chevron deference and the establishment of Loper Bright, meaning that the agencies just don't continually get deference when you're talking about some of these highly technical, complex issues. And so, where members of Congress, a lot of them, and I haven't talked specifically to Administrator Zeldin about this, but I imagine he was in this relative camp that the state of play at that time was look, the Supreme Court had essentially decided if EPA determines that greenhouse gases are a pollutant, then they may establish regulations to control that effective pollutant. It's called the endangerment finding, and that's really what this all boils down. And since 2009, the Obama administration, they took a legitimate scientific process and did what they often do, which is replace it with a rushed political process so you have political outcomes, thus the establishment that greenhouse gases, and in particular carbon dioxide, the gas you and I exhale, is a pollutant. And going back to when I worked in the Senate and we had a lot of scientific experts submitting expert testimony to a variety of oversight hearings, one of them famously said, if you can control carbon, you can control life. So listeners just need to know that all of these efforts around controlling CO2 and other purported greenhouse gases, it's all about handing the reins of economic and eventual cultural control into the hands of the political left. And they've been using places like EPA, the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy to effectuate these standards. So it was a politicized process. And from a basic scientific perspective, from 2009 to today, the scientific understanding surrounding a lot of the elements that impact the climate have substantially changed. Even if you talk to the most risk averse UN based climate scientists, they will admit that. So, in the very least, this science needs to be reassessed. Just take COVID, for example. If we did not reassess the initial understanding of COVID and how it impacts society, we would still all be in masks and locked into our rooms and our houses, not able to go out and about. Reassessing scientific assumptions and analyses is so important, especially when that science is used to impact such broad reaching public policy. And really quick, if EPA were to reassess this, which I think they will, not only because there's a lot of momentum and effort around it from a technical perspective, but from a scientific understanding, it just makes so much sense. If they were to reassess this would impact things like the EV mandate. This would impact the left's desire to prohibit the development of the very resources that we need that power our modern economy. This is the extraction, refinement, and use of coal, oil, and natural gas that still make up 80% of our daily energy needs. So just a few examples of how everyday citizens' lives would actually be significantly impacted by the reassessment of this finding that most people probably have never heard of.
Yeah, it's so important. I hope people will recognize the significance of this. It sounds like an obscure regulatory issue. It's not. This affects all of our lives, our economy, our national security. And during the first term, I spoke several times on the record, interviewed Donald Trump's climate advisor, Dr. William Happer of Princeton University. And he was not shy about saying, look, this whole idea that CO2 is pollution is total nonsense. The planet is starving for more CO2, he told me. He said plants are designed to live in an atmosphere with 4 to 5 times as much CO2. And he is one among many leading Ivy League scientists who have really just ridiculed this notion that carbon dioxide is some sort of dangerous, toxic pollution. Mandy, I want to switch gears now to the international front. The last time you and I spoke, Trump had not been sworn in yet, and you talked about the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. You helped lead the effort to get us out of the Paris Agreement the first time. And in the first administration, Trump kind of played along with that idea that we had to wait 4 years to get out of it. This time, it doesn't seem like he's monkeying around. He just said, effective immediately, the U.S. ambassador to the UN needs to say, we're done. We're done with all these other things. No more money. So talk to us about the international front. What is the significance of this? What happens now to the UN climate regime and the climate process? And what does that mean for Americans?
Yeah, I think for Americans, it's a very clear indication that President Trump is putting the interests of the United States first. The Paris Climate Accord was an America Last agreement, and it really sold out the US economy, US workers, and everyday consumer costs that manifested itself in all sorts of ways. It sold that out to the benefit of these climate elites that will give places, they will cheer places like India and China for signing this piece of paper. Meanwhile, ignoring the very real fact that that piece of paper did nothing to reduce their exponential growth in all sorts of emissions. Sure, greenhouse gases, but also traditional pollutants, things like particulate matter, nitrous oxide. And that's because their coal plants that they are building today do not use the modern pollution control equipment our US coal producers, oil and gas producers have been using for decades. So they are spewing out pollution we know how to control, but because they signed this piece of paper, the elites over at the UN, they feel important and like they actually achieved something. They actually applaud them while putting the thumb on the economic scale of the American economy and the American workers, leaving us to deal with all the cost and consequences. So, getting out of the Paris Climate Accord, it's such a big deal. I'll reiterate what I started with. The president did not waste any time. And that's because you have to think about this as this is his 9th year as president. Even though he wasn't technically in the White House, he never stopped thinking about being president and what he would do to fix the economy and fix these problems. He saw how not only that globalist mentality, how it was celebrated by the political left, but how the Biden administration had given those ideas a front row seat to the U.S. economy, and how that really made American lives so much harder. It made energy costs go up, it made gas prices go up, and it made us susceptible to these international regimes that do not have the interests of the American citizens at heart, and certainly don't have the interests of our allies abroad. So, yes, getting out of Paris Climate Accord, it's one agreement, but it really it resets the scale to where the president's focus is on American interests, helping our allies where we can. And when it comes to energy development, use, and dominance, if you will, we can do a lot.
Yeah. Mandy, I got to ask you this because a lot of people are concerned about this. You know, best case scenario, Trump's president for another 4 years. Maybe really, really best case scenario, we get another conservative Republican for 8 years after that. But eventually, we'll have another radical Democrat in the White House. And as we saw after the first Trump administration, pen and a phone, undoing a lot of what the president did. What can Donald Trump do to make these changes more sustainable so that the next Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Barack Obama can't just come in and undo it all on the first day in the White House?
He can shrink the size and scope of the federal government, because what we saw is that the left was able to come in and corrupt various agencies that for many years had lost sight of their mission and became a tool of the left, not to advance the benefit of the American people, but to advance the power of the political left. And so a lot of the work that Elon Musk is doing with the Department of Government Efficiency, he's shutting down offices, getting rid of superfluous, redundant full-time employment roles. He's really shrinking the size and scope, and that's really important, not just for the longevity of these policy actions, but yes, inevitably, another left-leaning Democrat will eventually assume the White House again, but they are going to be handed an administrative state that is rightfully put in its place and can rightfully be checked by the people, by Congress, and in the courts. For the past few years, there was this major imbalance where everywhere you looked. I mean, the left was censoring people, violating First Amendment rights, infringing on the ability of certain types of businesses like gun owners and manufacturers to do what they do best, called in-use discrimination. They were debanking people, cutting off access to electricity, all sorts of tools that the federal government had grown to such scale and size that it permeated every single facet of everyday life. So the biggest thing the president can do to protect the interests of we, the individual people, whether we're a business owner, manufacturer, or a stay-at-home mom raising your family and educating them in the way that you think is appropriate and right, the best thing he can do is shrink the size and scope of the federal government so it's not as powerful or intrusive of a tool for the next administration that will try to abuse it.
Oh, I love that. And actually that touches on the subject of your book that I really want to get to in a moment. How do we drain the swamp? But I have another question for you too. I go to these UN climate summits almost every year, and at the one that they had in Arabia, I ran into all 7 of the U.S. senators in the U.S. delegation, and I asked them to their face. The polls show most Americans don't even believe the man-made global warming hypothesis. Donald Trump is very likely going to be the next president. He's going to blow all this thing up, and so you guys are running around here like, promising all this money, promising that you're going to do all this. How do you make these promises knowing what I just told you? And the answer from Senator Coons, Senator Cardin on Senate Foreign Affairs kicked it over to Senator Coons to give the answer. What he said really haunted me, and we have seen some truth to that. He said, don't worry. With the Inflation Reduction Act, we're sending billions of tax dollars to all these Republican districts, all these Republican states. They're all hooked on the money now, and so we've got them. Doesn't matter who's the next president. I mean, of course, Trump is not good, but we've got them all hooked now. Is there a way, and I saw that. I was in Baku, Azerbaijan just a few months ago. 5 Republicans showed up, and yeah, they talked about energy and stuff, but every single one of them, we got to reduce CO2, we got to do carbon capture, because huge projects in their districts now, funded by the federal government, are taking place. Is there any way at this point, Mandy, to extricate ourselves from this? Or, as Senator Coons suggested, is it all over? Do they have enough Republicans in the bag to be able to keep marching on with this?
No, not at all. And I think the more Republicans' eyes are open to the fact that, what you're seeing at USAID, so much of this fraud, this misuse of taxpayer resources, what the left has done is they've taken issues that people are highly emotional about, like climate. And then they use it to just shovel out taxpayer dollars. And typically, those shoveling the taxpayer dollars out the door, they have some sort of kickback, usually in the form of it going to some nonprofit for which they or their spouse sit on the board. There's all sorts of really deceptive ways that they take taxpayer dollars that they say is going for some global good, whether it's climate, whether it's poverty, whether it's water in Africa, or trans rights in the Middle East, which we're seeing coming out from a lot of the data that is at USAID. I think the more Republicans' eyes are open to the fact that climate is just as convenient of excuse for the Democrats to initiate this money laundering scheme for taxpayer resources, they will get back to the facts. And the facts are what we started with. Look, the science it's still evolving when it comes to understanding the climate. If you talk to any climate scientist, not an activist, so much of climate science per se is being rephrased from the view of activists. But if you talk to the real scientists, atmospheric chemical experts, physicists, people who assess water levels for various rivers that are really important in different regions of the world, if you talk to these people, they say that there's been no indication that there is catastrophic global climate change and that humans are causing it. They will tell you that point blank, whatever indicator you're ultimately looking at. So I think Republicans need to get back and not be afraid to actually look at the science and then, two, the policy facts. I mean, the left use their green new scam or their climate agenda, if you will, to impose added costs on the American people, added costs in the form of higher groceries, higher gas, higher electricity bills. And they also use it as an excuse for why electrical grids are no longer reliable. You have rolling blackouts and brownouts, things that technologically we shouldn't be dealing with. But because politics has infiltrated engineering decision making for how electrical grids are built out and what resources are used to power them, American citizens are having to deal with it as if it is an acceptable status quo. So the more Republicans realize that and the harm that these policies have caused, and that it really is just a part of this, emotional money laundering scheme that the Democrats have been using for a really long time, to enrich themselves at the end of the day, I think they'll be willing to reassess. And nobody is lost. People like to say that all the time to avoid people going in and having a legitimate debate or conversation. But it's a whole new world now, from a legal, from a technical, and from an open-ended debate state. And I think the time is right to engage in on these issues that some may characterize as third rail or too difficult. The time is now to engage and actually have thoughtful, fact-based discussions.
Absolutely. And speaking of thoughtful, fact-based discussions, your new book is extraordinary. Y'all fired. I love it. You, of course, live in Mississippi. A Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. Mandy, before we let you go, explain to us, how do we restore federalism? How do we drain the swamp? And where can people get a copy of your book to get the details?
Yeah, the biggest thing is restoring a lot of the power that has slowly been eroded from the states to Washington D.C. and give it back to those states. You've seen the president. I think the best case he's talked about this is in Federal Emergency Management Association. Look, they are agency. They should not be in charge. They should be there to support where the states lead. The same thing with a lot of environmental rules. There is something called a cooperative federalism as it is embedded in really important statutes like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and on and on. The idea is that The states lead and the federal agency cooperates based off of their relative expertise and understanding of key factors that are important when it comes to environmental protection. So it really is restoring power back to the states. You're already seeing a lot of that. And that will continue to happen as the Department of Government Efficiency reduces the size, scope, and importantly, the reach of the federal government. And you can get a copy of my book. It's available on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. You can also follow me on @MississippiMG on X. I post a lot about the book and what's going on and how it's so wonderful to see. Like all of these reforms are completely overdue, and it's once and for all restoring the role of the individual over that of the unelected bureaucrat, something the federal interests lost sight of for far too long.
Amen. Fascinating discussion, Mandy. Excellent new book, Y'all Fired, A Southern Belles Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. Mandy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing this book. I hope we can talk to you again very soon, and God bless you, ma'am.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, folks, go get a copy of that. It's called Y'all Fired, A Southern Belles Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. You can find it anywhere good books are sold, including Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. Get over to our website, libertysentinel.org. Sign up for the newsletter. There's some shifting in terms of where our stuff is going to be appearing. So get over to the website, libertysentinel.org. You're never going to miss anything that we do. And stay tuned for more. I'm Alex Newman. This is the Sentinel Report. Until next time, thanks for watching, and God bless you all.